keeping with the zeitgeist of the 1990s and the zeal that many blacks had for tough on crime legislation. And I mentioned that I didn't vote for Bill Clinton because I'm in the minority, right? I mean, most black people did vote for Bill Clinton. Yeah, I didn't vote for the Republican. I hadn't been lobotomized. But I couldn't, but my line about not voting for Bill Clinton or Al Gore, for that matter, was if I wanted to be a Republican, I would be a Republican. I wouldn't go for Republican light, which is what they ran on from, in effect, the damage that they inflicted on the trade union movement to the Clinton Republicans' embrace of Reagan Republicans' racialized war on poor people, right? I mean, that was racist. All the underclass ideology that Bill Clinton had spewed at that time, which contributed to the zeal for the tough on crime legislation, right? The super predator language and that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of blacks voted for Bill Clinton. Despite that, and I would say even partly because of that, Toni Morrison, for God's sake, described Bill Clinton as our first black president, right? But part of the reason for this, to take forever to get to this point, is that the black murder rate was very high, right? I mean, I think the black murder rate at the time was like 7 or 8 times higher than the white murder rate.
It was
likewise
reflected in the culture, right?
Well,
to your point, we get Boyz in the Hood,
right,
which is 91. So this is right before Clinton comes into office. We're at the end of Bush Senior. The music kind of reflects it, right? Everywhere is a ghetto and a war zone. And coming from the ghetto war zone, yeah, people were getting shot. Shootings happened a lot, and the cops weren't there. And I lived down the street from the police station.
Wow.
And the cops just they didn't fuck with you where I'm from. It's Bill Clinton did a I want to say it was during when he was campaigning for Hillary, and he was in a room full of black people, which I'm sure black people turning on Bill Clinton is probably still fucking with him to this day. He probably has nightmares about that shit, like with the saxophone on Arsenio. Like, that was a long time
I'll wear boxers. And I'll feel your pain. Right.
Yeah. My grandma met Bill Clinton and loved the hell out of him, by the way. He was that white guy, right? He was that Southern gentleman. Anyway, these black people are just yelling at him. And at some point he loses his cool and he's like, you asked for this. You weren't saying this back then.
Right.
And
that's true.
It's true. I remember how there's a mall not far from where I grew up, and that mall started having a rule that two kids in general, but they meant little colored kids, couldn't, if it was more than 2 walking side by side, some mall security would break you up. I don't know if your neighborhood was like that too, but that's how it was. People were getting shot at the movie theater.
Right. No, and some of those films where people were getting shot or where shots were fired were reflections, as you said, as you referenced, on the zeitgeist as well. Like, I mean, as I recall it, and memory's inventive, so what do I know on this? But it was that films that were black films, often enough, like Boyz in the Hood and those kinds of films. And I'm not suggesting that Boyz in the Hood was one of the films for sure where shots were fired, but it was that genre of film. It was.
Them motherfuckers shot at Boyz, man.
Yeah.
To hear the rest of this show and more, go to This Is Revolution Podcast. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, SoundCloud, and wherever else you get your podcasts. This is Revolution. Oh, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.